All right, welcome back, everyone, to the latest episode of World Bigfoot Radio. We have a returning guest showing up here tonight, which is Dave the Exorcist. And after the last episode that I did with him, we had a bunch of people that were asking more questions and that just wanted more information on some of the stuff we were talking about. And I figured that since he's done a bunch of research on this, I've done a bunch of research on it, and a bunch of my people that follow what I've been doing will remember that about a year ago, me and Wes did an episode for Conspiracy Corner on the history of the giants, and we sort of ended up like right after the flood. Well, what me and Dave are going to do tonight is we're going to pick it up right there and bring her up to present here, and we're specifically going to be talking about how the giants got over to North America, where they may have come from, how they spread around, what time it may, dates really approximate dates, when any of this stuff may have been happening. And we're going to try and tie it all together and give you guys a history of the giants from the Levant up to the giants of the Wild Wild West. And so that's what we're doing tonight. Now, for those of you who didn't hear the original show or may have forgotten parts of it, we were talking about the Nephilim, which are mentioned not only in the Old Testament, Genesis 6, and also in Numbers, but they're also mentioned a lot in the Apocryphal books, Jubilees, Jasher, Enoch, and, of course, the book of Ogius, book of the Giants, which Og, king of Bashan's dad, supposedly wrote, so written by a giant even. And so that was the source information we used to cover a lot of that stuff back in the original episode. And we talked about the culture we talked about, because of their massive size, that a lot, if not all, of the megalithic structures that we see on the face of the earth at this point are basically the leftovers that were made by them before the flood, and that could be up to and including the Great Pyramids. We just were talking a couple days ago about this one video that you can look at on YouTube where they went inside the tomb of the royal architect who actually built a lot of these monuments and whatnot during the time this was going on. There was a lot of major construction over there in the Nile Valley. And on all of these, the inside of his tomb, of course, he's rich, so richly decorated tomb, there's all these beautiful murals that show, well, there's giants moving these rocks around. There's little humans that are carving them, but there's these huge giants moving all this stuff around. So, it seems like there's a pretty clear link there, too. And then also there's the link with the Peruvian, Praca skulls that Ron Moorhead was doing stuff on. L.A. Marzulli's involved with. They supposedly got a piece of one of them to check for DNA, and it turned out to be non-human. Where the insertion for the spinal cord is in the wrong place on the skull. The skull has a greater internal volume than a human skull has. There's just too many anomalies on it for it to be considered a human skull. Now, when Marzulli had it, and he had a medical expert looking at it, one of the first things the medical expert said is that the subject here must have been a creature with a very long neck, because of where the insertion for the spinal cord was. It would have had to have had a long neck to hold its head up in the right position. And L.A. immediately went, bing, there's this light bulb above his head going off. You guys got a picture of that. Bing, oh my God, long necks. That's a direct translation of the word Anakim, which is one of the sub-varieties of the Nephilim. And if you look at the depictions of King Tut and his father, Akhenaten, they also had that same weird anomaly to their physiology. So they were at least part, if not completely, Nephilim. So there was like a huge Nephilim connection with Egypt, and we're going to be talking about that in a lot greater depth here. So just to keep in mind now that we're talking about after the flood. Before the flood, the giants and, I think tribes that were still existing after the flood that had some of their bloodlines were referred to them as Nephilim tribes, and some of those were hybrids. Some of them may have looked a lot like humans and just had like a little bit of Nephilim blood, but they were still contaminated, so they were considered to be Nephilim. So Nephilim, were all the giants Nephilim? Probably. Are all Nephilim giants? No. And the other thing is that the flood was God's way of getting rid of these abominations so he could start over with a clean slate, basically, because they had been using their abilities, whether magical or genetically manipulating, to create these awful, monstrous hybrids, not only these enormous giants that were eating humans, but also chimeras, other types of monsters, and, with presume, subservient races that were doing their dirty work for them. You know, they may have even been involved with engineering things like dinosaurs. We just don't know. But so at the time that all this was going on, God's wrath was great. There was a huge disaster on the earth. The waters of the deep broke open. The waters of the sky started raining down. Massive flood. Everything gets wasted, and the big giants are all gone. Now, all the giants before the flood are called Nephilim, but after the flood, they're not called that anymore. Now, the Nephilim doesn't mean giant. It means fallen ones. And after the flood, they're called Rephaim, which means risen ones, but it carries a connotation that's really spooky that sort of makes you think they're talking about them being walking dead. And there's other things connected to the accounts of them after the flood that sort of even bring this point home a little bit stronger than just that appellation right there. But before I get any too much further on with just blabbing on endlessly, I want to bring my guest Dave on. Hey, Dave, great to have you back on the show, man.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure to have you here, brother. Yeah, so like I said, we had already done this show on the early parts of the whole history of the giants, where they came from, what they were, how they were pretty much ruling the earth and had, you know, done their best to mess everything up and got smote and wiped out as a result of it.
Let's talk about why the devil was doing all this. That you know, the question that I would have at the beginning of hearing about this stuff, and that's the question that I really sought out, is what in the heck was all this stuff about?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the New Testament had not been written, and you know the Old Testament hadn't even been written at that time. And but the devil pretty much knew that God was going to do something. He'd gotten a prophecy from Adam concerning Adam and Eve about you know, he'd bruise the foot of the heir of Eve, and that heir would bruise his head.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew there was something coming in the future.
Yeah.
And his goal today, and for any of those folks that are monitoring this show, you need to hear this too. His goal today was the same as his goal then, to get the earth so polluted with corrupt DNA that God would give up and not come back. Because the only thing that he understood about God was angry and vengeful.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the God that has reached out to humanity. And he had already created Hades, the underworld, hell, and the lake of fire for them. They knew their future was not going to be good and that they were already damned. And his whole MO is to say, now that especially now that, because he knows the Bible, now that he knows his end is the lake of fire, his whole MO is to so corrupt the gene pool on planet Earth so that God gives up and walks away.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's his only hope. And that's what all of this stuff, with all the things that we're hearing about UFOs, all of the stuff about the giants, especially when you look at the Septuagint, which once the priests and Pharisees had walked out and given themselves up to Alexander the Great, and they became a part of the Egyptian empire on his march to Egypt, they thought, well, we need to have our Bible, our holy word, in Greek, because we need to have ourselves represented in the Greek government, and we needed documents that are in Greek. And so they paid. Now, this is several hundred years before the book of Malachi, I believe, or at least before the New Testament. They had their entire holy word translated into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint Bible. And it is the most accurate translation. It's in Greek, but it's been translated by several folks into English over the years.
And these are the series of their early books that are supposedly ascribed to Moses writing them, correct?
Well, and the prophets. This is the whole Old Testament.
Okay.
Now, at the time, it didn't include the book of Daniel because it was written in the Chaldean language, and most of the Jews to this day don't know what's in the book of Daniel because it's not part of their tradition, even though it's in their Bible. But it talks about in the Septuagint, in the 13th chapter of Isaiah, that he's going to send the giants to perform his wrath at a future date. Now, this happened in the year somewhere around 200 to 0 BC. And this is a serious deal. He said, behold, I'm going to quote it just from memory, behold, I'll send the giants to perform my wrath. They shall come amusing, but then they shall be hideous, or something like that. And then at the bottom, in the last verse of it, he's talking about satyrs coming. So these things are going to come from somewhere, and the folks that are using terminology, you know, they're kind of turned off by using the words portal and stargate and all this kind of stuff, even though those are the words the Native Americans are using and have been using for a long time, especially the Four Corners area.
Yeah.
But we just call it an opening in the spirit realm.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that these things are more than likely, these things are the undead, well, there's going to be something spooky happen in the future, folks. You know, as Marzulli says, when we go up, they come down.
Yeah.
And there's
and
going
again,
to be,
we don't know how much of how direct this translation is. They could literally be saying that the giants' bodies that you see are the dead giants that have been raised again through black magic.
That they're going to resurrect. I mean, that's exactly what it's implying. There's no ambiguity at all. They are going to show up either through some kind of a portal, or they are going to rise from the dead.
Right. Well, the point I was going to make is that to people without the technological know-how or the wording for it, somebody who is in suspended animation and stasis underground, then suddenly the chamber opens up and they come out again. Well, that's rising from the dead. That's the best way they could describe it. But we could be looking at literally rising from the dead. We don't know exactly.
Yep, happened before. When
Yep.
You say, well, Jesus rose from the dead, but he still had his body. Well, when Jesus was crucified, a worldwide, a big earthquake happened. It was recorded around the world, pretty much. The sky went dark for 3 hours. A lot of people think it's a Nibiru passed on the lee side of us, but the dead came out. You go check your Bible, folks. The dead were raised and walked around Jerusalem testifying.
Yeah, that's documented. There's a bunch of sightings of people that had been, actually quite a while dead, suddenly walking around the streets, and everybody's like, whoa, isn't that so-and-so? I thought he died like 2 months ago. He stinks bad.
Or isn't that Joseph? My gosh, he's been dead 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and again, this is all really creepy. So whichever angle you're coming from it is extremely creepy. And then you look at the story. Okay, what other Old Testament stories do we have about giants? We've got Goliath and his 4 brothers. So David picks up 5 stones. Okay, I'm going to wipe out 5 giants. I got my sling. God's on my side. These giants don't have a chance. He takes a shot. He hits Goliath right in the forehead. Goliath falls over on his face. Now, the question is, did that shot actually kill him, or did it just stun him? But the interesting part is what he did next is he ran over, pulled out Goliath's own huge sword, and cut his head off with it. And how many times have you heard stories about, like, zombies and other undead, where the only way you can stop them is to get rid of the head?
Mm-hmm. And here's a really good point. David carried that head, according to Jewish history, David carried that head in a burlap bag. Mm-hmm. Until he was made king at Hebron.
Yep.
Now that's a while, folks.
Yeah,
that was a couple of years.
Just separate from the Bible, if you go back and you look at all the Eastern European traditions about vampires and stuff, if they wanted to get rid of one of them, they had to cut its head off and burn its body.
Yep.
Just separating the head from the body wasn't even enough. They had to make sure they got rid of the body, or it somehow could get its head back and start over again. So they were really, really careful about how they dealt with these things, because there were only certain prescribed methods that could actually get rid of them. But we're digressing a little bit too much here. Now we're on Transylvanian vampires. But to get back to what we're talking about, we came in here and God had already promised where the Israelites were going to move into eventually. So Satan knew where they were going to, and he had about 300 years to set up some obstacles for him there. So when they came wandering into the Holy Land and did a little recon, they went, oh, geez, these guys are like enormous. We look like grasshoppers compared to them, you know. There's like giants here, man. I thought they were all gone. So, you know, one of the things that always interested me is how exactly did they get rid of these giants? And I don't think we've got a really good answer for that, you know. Neutron bombs, poison, whatever it was that they were using, they managed to do it. The point that we're coming to here next, though, is that at the time that they managed to dispose
they
of this
rope them and behead them.
Yeah, they roped them and behead. Whatever it was that they did, burn them at the stake, you know, impaled them.
Behead them.
They somehow got rid of them. And apparently some of them, very small pockets of them, were still in the Holy Land for a while, because then you have, you know, Goliath and his buddies showing up later on. But the majority of them seem to have hightailed it out of there. And those are the ones that we're interested in. And we know for, you know, as I was telling you guys during the beginning of the show, some of them definitely either were or went from there to Egypt and were working with the Egyptians afterwards and even became parts of the royal family. And it may be possible that that's how they got over here from the Levant, by being tied into the Egyptians, who were great shipbuilders and experts at navigation, and may have made it over here that way. Now, the other option is that they could have taken the long way around. And what do I mean by the long way around? Well, they could have gone overland. They could have just spread up into Asia, went, you know, east in Asia until they got up into Siberia, waited until it was cold, got across the Arctic ice over into Alaska, and came down that way. But it doesn't look like that's what happened. And here's one of the reasons that I think that they didn't do that. We've got a lot of archaeological evidence of there being mounds, megaliths, and the same sort of stuff up in Siberia and Eastern Asia that's all over the rest of the world. But we also have some more recent information from that area that archaeologists have dug up about what the Russian mythological and archaeological experts call the Kurgans. Now, the Kurgans were supposedly another tribe of giants, and if you go to Moscow today, you can see a statue of one that's like 25 feet tall. Now, the Kurgans, they know from their expansion whether they were giants or enormous humans or whatever the heck they were. From 4500 BC to 3750 BC, were spreading westward into Eastern Europe and took over most of Russia. So at the time that the giants that were in Canaan would have left that area, they would have been unable to move up into Asia because the Kurgans had all of it. And they were just notoriously incredibly ferocious. And as we know from looking at even the most vague and basic information on this subject, giants did not get along with each other. They were just as prone to kill each other as anybody else. So if you had one giant, really powerful tribe in an area, they weren't very likely to let, you know, immigrant giants from some other area come wandering in.
Let me interject about that video we saw that I sent you. You can type in Kurgans on YouTube, and you will see
K-U-R-G-A-N-S.
K-U-R-G-A-N-S. You will see video of museums over in Russia and the Ukraine. Mostly it was Hungary was their main place where their headquarters, and they've got museums there with beautiful swords. These things the blades are 5 foot long. And not just one, they've got dozens of them. They've got bows. The bows the crazy things are over 10 foot. And they're in remarkable condition. They've got other swords that look similar to samurai swords with blades that are 8 foot long. And this isn't stuff people made up. You can actually see the museum pieces with kids standing next to them. They're in the museums.
It's physically there. And to continue on with what I was saying now here, whether it was the Kurgans or whether it was the Canaanite giants, some tribe of giants went up and took over Europe too. And they've actually got good examples of the same sort of thing you're talking about, except they're battle axe heads. They've got them in a museum in Denmark. The Danes have them. And the battle axe heads themselves, without the haft, weigh 150 pounds. There's no way in hell any human ever wielded these things. They're enormous, okay? So, you know, either they made these things just to impress the neighbors or giants made them, okay? There's your two choices. And, again, you have the same megalithic structures. In Scandinavia, they have what they call the giant's throw. And these are like huge boulders, like, you know, the size of a station wagon or a minivan
Volkswagen,
that are like on top of another big boulder, and they've got that it's sitting on top of. Without a modern-day crane, you could literally have not moved that top rock and picked it up to put it into place, much less had these other little rocks underneath it. And there's lots of examples of this. There's lots of examples of these megalithic structures. There's lots of examples of these mounds, the same kind of mounds that we've got over here in the central U.S. And what's also interesting about the area of Scandinavia, go back and look at their mythology. Frost giants. What did frost giants look like? Oh, they're like 3 times the size of human. They were white. They had red hair, and they had blue eyes. Sound familiar? This is exactly what the paintings in the tomb of the royal architect in Egypt looked like, and this is also the exact same description of the giants in North America. So whether or not it was the Canaanites, they match the description of what we ended up with over here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they match Lovelock cave giants.
And that's another thing. And let's get into that now, Dave. You take it away from here and talk a little bit about what may have happened as far as the Egyptians coming over to this part of the world, sure, and possibly bringing the giants with them.
Well, here, let me as a way into that, let me set the stage. Egypt was the superpower of the world. It was the trading superpower. It was the merchandise superpower. They were it. People from all over Europe came to Egypt to do business. The reason that the giants didn't mess with the Egyptians during the time of the Levant was there were too many of them. Now, you got to remember Jericho. Now, Jericho's over by the Dead Sea, and they're regular people. And when the 12 spies went into the land, they got to Jericho, and Rahab the harlot said, they've been in the wilderness for 40 years because the first 10 of the spies didn't believe God's report that they could take them, and only 2 did. So they spent 40 years in the wilderness till all those guys died off. And the woman at Jericho told them, we know about your God and what he did to the Egyptians, and the fear of you is upon us all. Well, they made arrangements for her when they attacked the city. She put out a red cloth, and she's in the lineage of Jesus. So King David and Jesus. So the Lord's not as hard-hearted as he's been depicted. These folks that he had slaughtered in the Old Testament were giants. They carried the Nephilim DNA. They were not ordained of God, and they were no way going to make it into heaven.
And anybody that wants to dispute that, go back, listen to part 1. There's 36 tribes. I gave the names of all of them that are either Nephilim or Nephilim hybrids. Every single tribe that God told them to wipe out completely were on that list.
That's right. So Egypt was a big deal. And even after the Exodus, Egypt became a big deal again. Now, here's a little thing I found was interesting. The Greeks were excavating a site that went back to antiquity and actually the time of the Levant. And when they dug down all the way down to it and they got the whole thing cleaned out, they looked up on the wall and there's a mosaic of the Exodus. And this is in Greece. And this is public knowledge, folks. I mean, I read it in a paper somewhere. Then you go back to the Bible and you look, and it said there were people who came out in the Exodus, who came out with the Israelites, the children of Israel, and then departed after Moses smote the rock and the water came out at Horeb. They departed and went on their way. And these folks would have caught a ship and went on back to Greece. So the world's not as primitive as even our pastors have told us it was. And so let's move on.
Don't forget, just to digress for a second, just to take us to the subject of Atlantis, which we'll be bringing up again. It wasn't Plato that originally came up with the story. It was like his grandpa Solon, who was over in Egypt and was talking to one of the temple high priests about history and this whole weird deal and the Great Flood. And the high priest said, well, you dumb Greeks are so recent, you don't know anything about history. That wasn't the only flood. There's been more than one great flood.
We started out last time talking about the first 3 verses of the Bible and how they've completely blown the translation. And even in other languages, they've used the King James as a guidepost. And the words Haya, Tohu, and Vabohu are in there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was Haya, and Tohu and Vabohu, and the waters covered the face of the deep, and the firmament rested upon the waters. Well, in English, that would be, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and Haya, the earth, it was completely desolate, or a wasteland. Pardon me, a wasteland. No, pardon me, I'm getting confused here. Haya it means had become. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth had become Tohu, utter chaos, and Vohu, a wasteland. And the waters covered the face of the deep, and deep space rested upon the waters. That's a destructive flood, and there's your pyramids, folks. There's all your stuff. Some of it was post-Genesis 1. A lot of it was pre-Genesis 1, including the dinosaurs. A lot of that stuff. So it's am I a creationist? You bet.
Mm-hmm. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here for people that are interested in looking at the biblical timeline is that before the great biblical flood, when the giants got wiped out, there was another cataclysm even before that, is what the Egyptians were saying.
Yeah, I'm an old earth creationist. I believe this is an old earth and that man's the one that's new and started in Genesis 1.
Amen,
I believe the stuff that was around before that wasn't us.
Nope. And that's what the fossil record says. Hey, there's Heidelberg Man. Hey, there's Australopithecus. Hey, there's Neanderthal. Those aren't humans. Right. Okay.
Well, actually, Neanderthal, I think, was an ape.
Well, we've got some Neanderthal genes that are close enough they could mate with us, but that still doesn't mean that they're humans. They're some humanoid thing. And we don't even know what they look like. A lot of the reconstructions could be completely wrong. Danny Vendermini did head paintings commissioned based on the idea that if you take a Neanderthal skull and you build it up on the model of a human, you'll get something that looks vaguely human. But suppose they didn't look like humans. Let's use a model of an ape and build its face up that way. And interestingly, the artistic depiction of that matches almost exactly what witnesses in North America are seeing when they're talking about Type 2 Bigfoots. And this is quite common knowledge in the Bigfoot community at this point. So, again, be suspicious of the way things are being presented to you from science. But let's go back to what we've got for actual archaeological history and maybe able to tie this together, because we got a connection with the Egyptians right here in North America.
Right. Let's give them if you want to see a picture of what that would have looked like, there's a book that came out called Them and Us, THEM and Us. And you'll see the depiction of Neanderthal as an ape. It's hard to say it wasn't. I've never seen her pictured a human with a 3-inch tall upper lip.
And which is what you get described as Bigfoot all the time. Well, the distance between their nose and their upper lip is wrong. It's like 2 or 3 times as much as what a human has. Bingo, bango.
You take away the slit eyes and you give them a hooded nose, and you got yourself a Type 2 Bigfoot.
And just for the benefit of the audience there, I'm going to be posting the even better version of that, which is redone by the Bigfoot Outlaws to conform to what people actually see, rather than the notion that Vendermini had. Because, just for everybody's purposes of knowledge on this, Danny Vendermini is not a Bigfoot guy. He doesn't believe in Bigfoot. He did this completely separate from the Bigfoot community and actually stumbled on possibly a really good answer for what some of these things might be or be related to. But I want to get us back on track here again now. From the Levant to the Wild Wild West, how did those giants get over here? Did they come over here overland? Did they come across the ice sheet? Did they sail here? There's a lot of pictures of them in the Egyptian tombs there with the architect, not only of building things, but of being on boats, classic Egyptian boats going around. So they knew what boats were and how to get across water on them. Sure. Do you think they sailed over here to North America with the Egyptians?
I think that they came independently of them and with them.
Okay.
I think that the majority of what they found the skeletons of in the Upper Appalachian and in New England, Upper Appalachian Plateau in New England, the mound builders, they're what we call them. I think that they basically the group that are east of the Great Plains, I believe that they sailed from the area around Haifa and Beirut. I believe they set sail from there. They sailed through the across the Mediterranean and out the Strait of Gibraltar. And it's not hard to get to North America from there. I believe they landed in New Jersey and went straight up onto the Appalachian Plateau in western Pennsylvania. And they also landed in New England, and that's where they settled. There was plenty of game, and those are where the megalithic structures and all that stuff is, while there is not much of that kind of stuff in the eastern Rockies or the Great Plains area, except for Minnesota. So I personally think that they got there that way, but then I also believe the ones from the west came with the Egyptians. And you know, I'm always been a history buff. I was a history major in college, and that and music. You know, what do I do for a living? Math. Boy, that was my weakest subject. But as soon as I found out it was money, I got better at it. History. When I got to Arizona, I lived there for Desert Southwest for a little over a decade, and one of the stories that fascinated me was the vaqueros. I guess they had another name for them. It was similar. It was kind of a cross between conquistador and vaquero. So I guess these guys probably carried a lance and a whip more than a rope. But they sighted between Highway 8 and Highway 10 in western Arizona, out northeast of Yuma, a Spanish galleon in the late 1700s. in the dry desert.
Out in the middle of the desert. Out in the middle of the desert, there's a Spanish galleon.
Well, and here's another funny story. About 60 years later, two American cowboys, and I guess it was more than that. About 80 years later, two American cowboys were out there and roped a flying pterodactyl, flying lizard. So figure that one out. That's a piece of history kind of spooked me.
That whole area is really scary. Now, to take people back now, at the time that's presumably the Egyptians showed up here, that whole area out there was actually connected to the ocean by a big inland sea.
Right.
And like you were saying, you could sail basically right up to that area, right off the ocean.
Yeah, you weren't very far from Blythe, California. I believe it went all the way up to Chocolate Mountain. So, you know, and to get to the Grand Canyon and the Egyptian remnants that have been found there, and we'll get into that in a minute, all you had to do was you get to the head of the river that's feeding this huge delta that you've come in through the Sea of Cortez, and you simply follow the water, and if you've gotten on the west side, which was the most easily to traverse, you would have come in through straight up through Blythe and then on up past Las Vegas and then around the north side of what's now Lake Mead. And then, boom, within just a few days' march, you are at that point on the north side of the Grand Canyon. And you're standing within a short amount of time directly over the area where the Egyptian fortifications and mummies are at.
Right. And there's that one area of the Grand Canyon that's got all the weird Egyptian names on it, and nobody's allowed to go there.
Yeah,
mysteriously enough.
Suddenly, all of this hit the papers in that area, and even made the Los Angeles paper. I've seen clippings, and about the giants and the Egyptians that were found in the Grand Canyon, etc. And then our beloved Smithsonian got involved, and
everything went back there for further study, and the area was closed off.
Yeah, that area is now closed to the public. Of our largest national park, well, Canyon Park, is now closed to the public, and that is all sealed off, and they've done away with the walkways and everything, stairs that were built to accommodate folks to getting there. They've done away with it all.
Yeah, from what I understand, the only way to get in there now would be by river, and they keep an eye on that area. So if you try to do that, they'd catch you.
Yeah, you can't get to it from the river. You've got to rappel down to it. That thing was giant-proof, and the folks that built it evidently built with wood stairways or ladders to get to that. But it was an ongoing long-term deal, and there are rumors that there are openings to that on the north side in the Kaibab Plateau, that there are ways out. and
now,
weighs
to give
in.
people a little bit more background on what we're talking about, a lot of the people that are interested in giants or Bigfoot have heard about Princess Winnemucca, the Paiute Indians, and Lovelock Cave, and the red-haired giants that were living there that were, just horrible monsters eating the Paiutes. Couldn't be dealt with. Finally, they had to catch them all in the cave, set a pile of wood on fire at the beginning of opening of the cave, and the smoke went in and choked them all to death, is how the story goes. Well, at the time that this was going on, that cave was sitting right on the shore of this giant lake that we're talking about the Egyptians sailing in on. That lake isn't there anymore, but it's very well documented that at that time it was.
Yes, this very well could have been a mutiny, kind of like Powell and his men had when they were going down the Grand Canyon. Some of them decided we're not going to do any walking. We walked as far as we're going to go, and we're not going to leave the water here.
Yep.
And we're going to stay here. And then they reverted to their old cannibalistic ways.
Yep.
And these very well may have been part of the crew that came over from not only from Egypt and not only there, but you get these are elongated skull rascals. That's the difference between these and the ones on the East Coast and the eastern United States. These had elongated skulls, and they have also been found on Catalina Island, and L.A. Marzulli has covered that. And those skulls, of course, our beloved Smithsonian came in and did away with, carted most of them off, but the museum has found a few skulls since then that they refused to submit. And I have seen close-up documentation on those, photos, etc. And Marzulli's got some stuff on those, too. They're still there in that museum. Now, I think they charge you now or something to look at them, and you're not able to handle them. But
and again, this is what we had mentioned earlier on in the show, that L.A. Marzulli had tentatively identified as the Anakim, one of the tribes of the Nephilim. Apparently we're the ones that were working with the Egyptians, and here's the same area where the Egyptians supposedly came to, and here we're finding their skulls in the same area. So really what it looks like, what you're saying, Dave, is that there may have been at least two separate and distinct invasions by the giants of North America. There could have been a whole different group that came over, from Northern Europe and came in that way, and then there was a different group that came in with the Egyptians.
Well, I don't know if they came from Northern Europe or whether I'm sure they resupplied there. I personally believe there were giants throughout that entire region, and the only reason that we're hearing about the ones in Palestine or the Promised Land is that's the part that God had promised to His people.
Right.
So,
so they're directly involved in the narrative. It was, of course, incumbent on them to mention the fact that there was a whole bunch of giants here, and we had to kick their butts out before we could take over.
Yeah, we still got the same megalithic structures and the same kind of thing all over Europe that we find in the United States. So there's no reason to believe that they're, plus the Kurgans, etc. There's no reason to believe that that entire part of the world, including parts of China, which, my God, I've seen the amphitheater they found underground. There's no way we even possess tools today that it could have carved that out. And
don't forget, folks, for those that are into archaeology, it wasn't that long ago that the Chinese found a whole bunch of 7 to 9 foot tall mummies with red hair, appeared to be white people, haplogroup X, out in the Gobi Desert.
Right. These things were the giants had reappeared post Noah's flood. When I talk about the flood, I quit calling it the flood now. I call it Noah's flood or Genesis flood or floods before that, because we have to keep in mind the Genesis flood of Genesis 1. Pardon me, Genesis 1. So there's Genesis 1 flood, then there's Noah's flood. So the rainbow really does have great significance when God says, I'm not going to do the flood deal anymore.
Yeah, next time I'm going to burn the earth.
Yeah.
Thanks, God.
Well, but he's going to come for his people first.
Oh, okay, good. Had me worried there for a second.
Yeah, we go up, they come down, or they come out. So, the one thing.
Again, if we had these guys established, let's follow your theory. Let's say some of them were just like jerks and didn't want to deal with the Egyptians anymore, and just went, nah, we're done. we'll go do our own thing. We'll live here. We'll eat the locals. You know,
well, and I
screw
think
you guys. We don't want to play anymore. Well, they spread all over the Southwest, and you've got all the local Indian tribes there telling stories about these same giants doing these same depredations on their tribes. And as I was talking to Caveman not too long ago, a lot of you will remember this, he was talking about how there had been, in their mythology, the hero twins. And the hero twins had showed up and helped them fight the giants and chase them out of their area. And according to their legends, they chased the giants north into the area where the trees were giant and there was always snow on top of the mountains. That's how far they chased them before they quit chasing them. But the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that in their mythology, the reason that they won this war, because they were on the losing end of the stick for a long time, things were going badly for them, was because these two hero twins had showed up to help them. And according to Caveman, and I'll virtually quote what he said, this is what white Western people would think of as demigods like Perseus and Hercules. They also were gigantic in stature, but for some reason they helped the local natives fight against these other giants and chase them out of there.
I think they were angels.
And it could have been.
I think they were angelic. I think they were God's angelic, and he sent them to help. And there's other reasons because of what I'll mention here in a little while about Utah and some other things. God loves people, and even if they don't know him, and even if if they don't have a revelation of him, he's a good God. And there's so many examples of angels showing up. Mm-hmm. And it says, be careful to entertain strangers, for in so doing, you've entertained angels unaware. And, the tribes that things have not gone well for them were the ones who had the same word for stranger as they did for enemy. Mm-hmm. And the tribes who are still around today didn't. And they greeted strangers.
Mm-hmm. Now, and don't forget the old weird custom of them holding up their hand. They got translated into Western filmography as them holding up their hand saying how. They were holding up their hand to make the guy on the opposite end hold up his hand so they could count fingers. If you had 6 fingers, you were an enemy and they wouldn't deal with you.
They meant run for your life.
Yeah, exactly.
You're on the menu.
You may not be able to tell exactly how big he is at a distance, but you're close enough to count fingers, you know whether you should run or not. That's
right. Run and hide. I think it's interesting that the Four Corners area, I don't believe that was the eastern giants that moved into that area. I believe it was these western ones.
I think you may be right about that because there seemed to be some differences between the way they acted and what they were building in those two different areas, and as well as the physiological differences in the skulls that you're mentioning. That seems to point to that, if they were related, they were two different species of the same critter.
I personally believe that the ones that were in the eastern United States, I can't say for all of them because what do I know? This is just the opinion I formed by looking into it a whole bunch. I believe that but what is that in a dollar I'll get you a cup of coffee. It's my humble opinion, and they're like belly buttons. We all got them, and they don't serve adults very much. But I'll share. My humble opinion that you didn't get a lot of sagittal crests on the giants that were in the eastern United States and Canada. I believe that the ones that were on the west side, I believe that they were more pure DNA Nephilim. Mm-hmm. Now, how they
Here's
survived.
An interesting story that I can use to back that up for you, Dave. This comes from the Native American tribes, and the Iroquois Confederation carries this around. A lot of the tribes in there still have it, and the Choctaw have it too, that there was a big, massive issue out on the West Coast, and it may have been a volcano or something, and a bunch of the tribes had to leave that area and move east. And when this tribe in question here, which probably ended up being several tribes further on in the future where we're at now, when they came up against the edge of the Mississippi River, there was a tribe of giants already sitting there that wanted to go across and couldn't. And the reason they couldn't go across is because there were these other giants that weren't part of their tribe on the east side of the Mississippi that were incredibly nasty, and they couldn't make a deal with them, so they were just stuck there. And when all these Indians came rolling up, they went, whoa, what are you talking about? And they said, well, yeah, these are the red-haired giants that were like 7 to 9 feet tall that they were talking to. And they said, there's these other guys over on the other side of the river here that are like twice as big as us. We're talking 15 to 18 feet. And they had the double rows of teeth. They had the 6 fingers and 6 toes. They ate everybody else who was smaller than them. So the legend is that the Indians actually teamed up with these smaller giants from the west, made war on these bigger giants, and chased their butts down the Mississippi to the south, never to be seen again. And that's how they ended up over in the central part of the U.S. Now, whether this was the remnant of the mound builders or if the giants they brought in with them became the mound builders, at this point we really don't know. But it's interesting, this legend seems to confirm that there were, in fact, 2 different tribes of giants, and the one of them even teamed up with the local natives to get rid of the other one because they're even more vicious and nasty.
Right. I personally believe that the ones with the elongated skulls, the Anakim, is that what you call them?
Yeah, the Anakim.
Yeah, I personally believe that those were remnants of the Nephilim, that they were more pure than Og, and I believe that they had joined forces with the Egyptians. Now the Bible doesn't depict this, so I don't have any scripture to tie it to, and I usually look for that. But I do know that at some time they made connection with them because of what's left in these tomb paintings in Egypt of these elongated skulls.
Exactly.
So,
and the people they're depicting, and this again includes Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, that whole weird royal family that decided to get rid of the multi-god worship and start worshiping one god. Ooh, that's kind of weird. And then they got overthrown by the priesthood in Egypt.
Yeah, and it weren't our gods.
Kind of tossed out again. No, but the point here is that these they were strictly not conforming to the way the Egyptians did things. And when they managed to gain power, they changed everything around and whizzed off all the humans that were working underneath them and swiftly got booted back out again. And again, these guys looked exactly like the Paracas skull guys. They had these weird elongated skulls. And they didn't have the double rows of teeth and stuff, but they had these weird elongated looking skulls. And and where did they come from down in South America? Well, once they got to the West Coast, all they had to do was march down through Central America and bingo bango, they were down in South America causing trouble.
Right. Well, not only that, but if they came from Egypt, they would have sailed around. I mean, there was no Panama Canal.
No.
They came up that way. I believe they were there. I believe that that those are the ones that were in South America, in Peru, and that's the ones that Tim Alberino, is that his name?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Marzulli and Moorhead, Ron Moorhead went down there with him. Yeah. And Steve Quayle and the whole bunch. I believe that's what they're talking about in Peru, is these same ones with the elongated skulls. And that whole culture there and in Bolivia is the same type of group that we ended up in the Grand Canyon. Now, that eventually came to the Inland Sea. Now that Inland Sea is a fact. It was there. Yeah. And it was there until at least the late 1500s, early mid 1600s. It's somewhere in there, because in the late 1700s they saw a Spanish galleon out in the desert that was hundreds of miles from an existing ocean. So we've definitely had some geological shifting and changing in the.
Well, as far as that goes, where I'm standing right now was under 200 feet of water not that long ago. Go look it up, guys. Glacial Lake Missoula. Yeah, the whole Bitterroot Valley was a big lake, and then one of the mountaintops broke, and everything came gushing out and caused havoc all over the place. Well,
and if you ever want to go to Navajo land, there you go on the road down through Tuba City, Mexican Hat, Tuba City, and all of that. And you stop on the side of the road and get out. There'll be a little seashell. You're at 5,500 foot elevation. There'll be a little seashell every 3 or 4 inches. Everywhere. Everywhere. Yeah. A little seashell. Every three or 4 inches, there'll be a little seashell about the size of a dime, and they're everywhere. I don't mean just where you stop your car. I mean everywhere. It's the bottom of an ocean. The draining of that ocean is what caused the Grand Canyon.
No, let's look a little bit more intently at South America here, where we have all of these old cultures that were all building megalithic pyramids, and all had these weird leaders that had blood rituals going on, and we're all talking about giants being around there.
Mm-hmm.
And basically being in charge of them.
How
many of these parallels do you have to see before it starts looking like it's the same thing all over the place?
Let's talk about North America first, and then we can stick to that.
Okay.
Because I want to talk about the Chinese, and I want to talk about the Minoans,
okay.
and I want to talk about the Aztecs. Now, the Aztecs their legend is, and I believe it, their legend is that they came out of Utah and that they were there approximately prior to 1000 BC, and that they were in Utah, and that was their area, and that when the giants came in, obviously these ones with the elongated skulls, they picked up and moved to Mexico. And where they settled was an island in the middle of a lake, and they built canals. These people were magnificent canal builders. And why would you build canals that are so deep instead of streets? And they were deep, deep canals.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they'd had enough of the giants. They pretty much made their situation giant-proof. And when Pizarro first entered Peru, his records show that they found skulls that were from the eye socket to the back of the skull anywhere from 36 to 42 inches. Those are big boys.
And they know the distance because in the report, they had one of these skulls and they were using it for a sword holder. They were putting their rapiers into the eye sockets, and the back of the sword blade was barely touching the back of the skull. So that's how they know the length.
And the scientists today have estimated, or in the last, 50 years, have estimated that was at least an 18-footer.
Yeah, I would say at least.
Now, if they were common enough for Pizarro and his men to find them, then they were common enough to be known by the natives if those skulls were still around.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's move on up to the Aztecs. The Aztecs, they built their city, canals and everything, and when Cortez came in and they burnt their ships, and the Aztecs saw that they'd burnt their ships, they knew they were in for a long siege. And so they started out friendly, didn't end up that way. And when things turned bad, the stories that I heard, now I saw this on the show with the forensic geologist, and again, I cannot remember his name, but he had talked about this, but I had heard this previously from some Mexican Americans and some folks from Mexico, that was the legend of that they're actually Aztecs lineage, and that they had come from Utah, and so that they had there was a mountain in Utah. It basically resembled a huge boulder. I don't know what the other side of it looked like, but the forensic geologist showed it on his show. And the legend is that when Cortez and them were raiding, that it was still in their memory they'd come from Utah, and evidently they knew that the giants had been cleared out. I personally think the Lord sent a plague in about the year 1500 because they all seem to have died out in that era. But they took their treasures up there and they hid them under this stone in a set of caves that they knew about, was in the oral tradition of their tribe, the Aztecs, mm-hmm. and that they had excavated under there, and that they had these subterranean areas underneath this huge boulders the size of an aircraft hangar, or bigger than an aircraft hangar, and they sent their people there to take their treasure and hide it there, and then they built a water system that filled the area around there completely, and this has all been submerged in water. Now, the geologist that had the TV show, he and some other divers tried to go in there. And the story is, the legend that they were telling about is that, and this was like a cowboy legend or a mountain area legend, that there had been folks that from the local community and from afar off that had come with scuba gear and tried to dive in there and had mysterious things happen to them. You know, Coonbo and Bear talk about suddenly your batteries go dead on your, around Bigfoot. Well, these people were in there and suddenly their tanks didn't work.
Oh God!
Suddenly their instruments are gone crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly their batteries have died in their cameras. Suddenly the lights are gone out. And there have been more than a few people have died in those areas. There have been, I guess they drug quite a few of them out. I don't know if they got them all. But when this, I can see his face, I can't think of his name, this forensic geologist, when he and that group, they had some bad things happen, and they got the heck out of there. And matter of fact, I think they were even denied the opportunity to dive there, and what he showed was some footage from somebody else. I can't remember for sure, but I know the legend, and I know that supposedly the Aztec treasure is there, that they came prior to the 1500 AD, or pardon me, after 1500 BC, 1500 BC is when the giants came, that's the Levant, and it took them a few hundred years to get to Utah, but when they did, that's when, well, actually, I think it could have been the ones that came with the Egyptians, and it would have not taken them that long, but at any rate, somewhere around 1000 to 1200 to 1000 BC, they moved out. And the time of the conquistadors and their raiding of the Aztecs, they sent their treasure back. So we've got that tie to Utah that predated the giants, their existence there. You predate the giants with the Anasazi. The Anasazi is simply Navajo for ancient ones, I believe. Some of the other Pueblo tribes go back almost to that time period, or do. I think the Puebla tribes do, and but they all have in their traditions, their history, they got bad encounters, and I think the Anasazi were the ones that were the most isolated and had the worst experiences. And coincidentally, in a odd, weird kind of funny, Bob Garrett, when he talked to Wes about his experiences there at Mesa Verde, I've been in that area, and how he camped out and he heard the moccasins on the, people that weren't really there, and he heard the moccasins, people walking and running and different things. I don't think those were good, as benevolent as he thinks they were. I think that's some of the leftover and residues of that area, the Anasazi and the Holocaust that happened to them, that Steve Quayle and all these, and Tom Horn and his group are talking about and holding this conference in Branson on the 10th, or pardon me, in September you look it up, I think it's the 23rd, and September 23rd. I had my meetings confused. At any rate, that's going to be a good one, and I think they've got just a few spaces left. But they were brought in by a guy named Mahudi, who had worked with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's in his 80s now and basically doesn't care. And he's blowing the whistle on the Smithsonian and a whole lot of stuff. He called, because these guys have done the work on the giants, he called them in and said that the elders of several tribes wanted to meet with them, and they met in Chaco Canyon. And, of course, you can see all this on their videos. But that they're shamans who, me having a background in deliverance, I'm not really crazy about quoting them, but I can tell you this much. They truly believe they've been, number one, physically the giants are buried there.